welcome to this morning's webinar, which is the first in our webinar series looking at the forthcoming regulation. So this first instalment is looking at a compliance roadmap for residential landlords. Just some very quick housekeeping. The webinar today is being recorded and it will be circulated after the webinar. The session is due to last 60 minutes, so there's roughly 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session today. So if you could use the Q&A tool in the Zoom taskbar as we go through, then we'll pick those up as we go. The speakers today are Rhianna Wilshire from Freets, Jennifer Hampton, who's joining us shortly. She's just caught up on another webinar at the minute, but she'll be joining us as we go through, from Ofgem, and Ian Allen from Switch2. So I'll hand you straight over to Ian.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. We are going to cover today, as part of a 3-webinar series. This is the first one. We're going to cover scope and scale of regulation reviews and actions and decisions that you're going to be faced with over the coming months and years, risks and consequences, and the support and resources that you can draw on to help you with this challenge. The first webinar today, we're going to look at a compliance roadmap, and we're going to give you an overview of regulation. We're going to talk also about or Jennifer's going to talk about the enforcement and compliance part of the Ofgem as well. So you'll get an overview and some thoughts about first steps. And then we're going to do, on the 11th of November, we're going to do a deep dive into the customer protection regulations. So looking at those in some detail, residents' rights and services, fair pricing, vulnerable residents, and supplier terms and contracts. And then on the third webinar, on the 11th of December, we're going to look at the technical standards and technical regulations, and possibly by then the HNTAS consultation might have been issued, but we'll have to see. So I think Jennifer's there. Yeah, morning, Jennifer. So I'm going to hand over to Jennifer, who's going to do 2 sessions today. She's going to do an introduction to the regulations. Then we're going to hear from Rhianna, and then and myself, and then finally Jennifer's going to then go into the compliance and enforcement part. So hand over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Ian, and apologies for my late arrival. If we could move on to the next slides, please. So, thank you. Just brief overview of heat network regulation, which will be commencing on 20s. Always get this confused. Sorry, next one, thanks. We've got the regulation starting in January 2026, so 27th of January 2026. Just to cover that, obviously the consumer and advocacy and redress schemes obviously already commenced on the 1st of April this year, which has been providing us with some really good intelligence of what consumer outcomes are at the moment. This will help inform our future regulation as we continue to develop. As I said, between now, Q3 and January, we're finalising the legal framework. There will be a final version of the draft authorisation conditions being published in November, and that will be the full suite of the draft authorisation conditions, which will be implemented on the 27th of January next year. So I'd encourage all stakeholders to look at those and see how that's going to actually apply to your specific circumstances. After January, the first big milestone, which isn't actually mentioned here, but during Q2 of 2026, our digital service will be going live. That's the first interaction that most heat networks will actually have with Ofgem, and I would hope the only interaction that Ofgem and heat networks have if everything is if all heat networks are registered and all monitoring data is provided via that digital service, there's going to be very little interaction between ourselves and any regulated parties. Where there is additional evidence or intelligence, or where there is monitoring data or registration data that indicates non-compliance, that's when we're likely to start interacting again via the digital service. And where there's further concerns, then we'll possibly start contacting you out with those channels, but I'll come to that later. So the initial period will continue till early 2027, and that's going to be the deadline for registration. And we will continue to phase in more protections as time goes on. If we can move to the next slide, please. So as I've outlined, we've got the different entry systems. However, registration is the first part of that via the digital platform, and that's for all existing heat networks, so deemed authorised, so no need to go through the authorisation gateway or licensing gateway, and licensing's a bit separate, so I won't go into that at all today. The ongoing regulatory activities that we are going to be monitoring and looking into over the first phase is consumer protection. Pricing will be introduced later on. However, we still expect to be looking at a lot of fair pricing examples and collecting data during the initial phase. Technical standards, as you probably know, will be introduced via the Heat Network Technical Standard Scheme from DESNZ, and that's separate at the moment, and will start coming on stream much later down the in 2027, you understand. Metering and billing, just to mention, there's already the Heat Network metering and billing regulations, and in order to satisfy the new regulations, it would definitely be worthwhile making sure that you're compliant with the current metering and billing regulations. And finally, coming on to financial resilience, which again will be phased in. If issues arise, we have various tools, and I'll touch on them later. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. And next. So just very quickly, the consumer protection overview. This is the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at. It's very much about the standards of conduct, which is about ensuring fairness for all consumers, making sure that they're treated fairly and that their individual needs are taken care of, especially if there are customers in vulnerable situations. So we've got here the transparency, billing and payment, and just how important those are. This will be introduced in January, as will the provisions around payment difficulty and vulnerability. Just to mention, guaranteed standards of performance, that's another element which is still to be consulted on and will be introduced. An essential element of bringing guaranteed standards of performance on will be about the data that we receive via registration and monitoring, and making sure that that's going to be working for heat networks and consumers as well. And I've already touched on fair pricing rules, so they will be evolving and being phased in as we go forward. And if you can move to the next slide, please.
Just struggling to turn my mic on. So we're now going to go over to Rhianna Wilshire at Wreaths, and Jennifer, you're going to come back in to talk about the compliance and enforcement later on. Thank you.
Thanks both. So just to introduce myself, I'm Rhianna Wilshire. I'm a partner here at Wreaths. We're a law firm that advises on heat networks from all kinds of service lines, whether that's on the project side, whether that's real estate, on the corporate side. So we're a full service law firm that specialises in clean energy, and I head up the heat network business. We have range of clients, whether that's residential landlords, house builders, commercial property, local authorities, energy services companies, so I'm going to refer to as ESCOs in here, and outsourced service providers as well. So we really do tackle this from all angles of the market. And regulation for me is particularly interesting because I've seen the market evolve over the last 16 years of specialising in heat networks, and I think now is the most exciting time with regulation coming in. So there's an awful lot of disruption in the market, but for very good reason. So it's an exciting time for me. Next slide, please, Ian. Whilst that's coming up, I just want to talk to you about assets. So when you're, as a business, considering how the regulations might impact on you, you have to look at your role in relation to heat networks on individual schemes and individual properties that you have. So you really do need to build up a picture because your role might change from scheme to scheme. The best way to do that is to do due diligence on the assets that you're holding. And what I mean by assets is the properties that you hold and how that interfaces and interacts with the heat networks within it. So do you have a high temperature system, for example? Do you have a low temperature system? Are you on a ground loop system? Does your building accommodate the energy centre, or are you just connected via the pipes and possibly some substations? Do you have control over that supply? Are you a landlord-led scheme? Or have you outsourced that control to a third party? And I'm going to refer to them as an energy services company, or ESCO, going forward. And I'll come on to the distinction between those in a minute, but if you remember that term, ESCO. Another variant might be, do you supply your customers directly? Does a third party supply your customers directly? Or do you receive a bulk supply from a connection into a wider network? What kind of contracts do you have in place? So do you have concession agreements, outsourcing to an ESCO, or do you have supply agreements in place directly with your customers, or do you pass costs through leases, for example? So you really do have to kind of, for each scheme, ask yourself a number of different questions which help build up a picture, and your due diligence will help you understand how your role fits in on various schemes, and by extension of that, how your role is interpreted into the regulation and what you have to do in compliance with that. Next slide, please, Ian. So in the 2025 regulations that have already been brought into force, we had 2 new roles that were created. There's the supplier, i.e. the company that makes the supply to the end users, in this case, most likely residents, and the operator, the company who has control of what they call transfer of heat across the network, so i.e. the distribution of that heat. It would be an offence to carry out either of those roles if you did so without authorisation, which makes it more akin to a licensing or gas type scenario. Thankfully, at the moment, everyone is already pre-authorised and will be for some time until 2027, when authorisation will have to actually be something that's taken forward proactively. But at the moment, all existing schemes and those before 27th of Jan 2027 will be pre-authorised. You might have more than one operator on a scheme. You might have someone who's in charge of the energy centre making a bulk supply to you. You're then responsible for the pipes and any substations downstream of that connection. So you'd be responsible for operating the part for which you have control. So you could have, for larger schemes in particular, a number of operators across the same network. For registration purposes, though, it's likely that we'll just have one operator per scheme and that they'll have to, in the background, liaise with the other operators and suppliers. It could be that you have the operator and supplier as the same party, or you could have different parties. But in most situations, the operator and supplier will likely be the same person. How can you tell whether you hold those regulatory obligations or whether they have been passed down to a third party like an ESCO? So looking at the operator one, because that's a bit more tricky to look at rather than suppliers. If you have got a concession agreement in place with an ESCO, depending on the terms of that concession agreement, of course, but generally, if you have leased the energy centre and plant and the network, and the ESCO has exclusive possession under that lease, i.e. no one else can kind of get in and interfere with that plant, then they will likely have the operational control of that plant. And alongside that will sit contractual obligations. So you must operate and maintain, you must take the risk post-adoption, and you're going to be insuring the kit as well. So if you have a long-term concession type agreement where you've got a lease in place and they take risk post-adoption, it's likely that they will be the operator, the ESCO will be the operator, and they will take on the regulatory role rather than yourself. So you will have transferred or delegated that to the ESCO. Where we're looking at suppliers, again, it's a bit simpler, because if you've got a customer supply agreement in, then you are the supplier. So for an ESCO type arrangement, the ESCO will be the supplier, because it's them who enters into the supply contract with your customers. If you haven't managed to transfer your regulatory burden over to an ESCO or to a third party in that way, then you might be looking at landlord-led scheme yourself. So in that situation, you may well have outsourced services to a third party, and we call it a fee for services basis. Might be much shorter term than an ESCO concession, but for all intensive purposes, as the landlord in control of that network, if you enter into short-term services contracts, which transfers no risk down to the service providers that might do metering and billing, operation and maintenance, for example, then you won't have transferred that regulatory burden, and you as a landlord will have, or in control of that building and in control of that network, will have to be the regulated operator. Again, if you are have entered into a customer supply agreement with your tenants and residents, or if you pass costs down through leases, or through tenancy agreements, and you're the one making the supply. If you've got managing agents on your site, again, you're not likely to pass the regulatory burden on to them, because they're acting on behalf of you, and so you are still that operator. Next slide, please. So very quickly then, just looking at those ESCO concession agreements, this is the first scenario I was talking about, where you've managed to pass down that regulated operator and supplier role. You'll probably have a long-term arrangement, 25 to 40 years. So it will really be incumbent on the ESCO to understand how they fit into the regulatory picture on that. So, but it might have an impact on them. They're going to have to comply with new administration, new reporting requirements, update their policies. With HENTAS coming in, there might be new technical standards they have to comply with. And so that will have a cost impact on them. It's incumbent on the ESCO to come to you and say, actually, there has been a change in law. This regulation has been brought in. The contract will have a change in law on variation process, or at least it should do. It's been drafted well. And that change in law process will say who takes the cost, or how that cost is split between the developer or the landlord and the ESCO and perhaps the customers, in the event that the change in law has a material cost risk. It might move the needle on the financial model, so you might have to look at opening up customer tariffs. The other thing to think about where you've got an ESCO involved is the supply agreements that they've entered into with customers and whether they need to be updated. Now, in the September guidance that Ofgem released, that the supply agreements don't need to be amended straight away. It can be as soon as reasonably practicable when, for example, when you've got new tenants coming in or new residents connecting into the network. Next slide, please. So if you don't have an ESCO concession and you just have a landlord-led scheme, or if you're in the receipt of bulk supplies into your building and you are supplying onto your customers, you might well be the operator and the supplier, excuse me, for any part of the network for which you have control. So you have to look at your supply terms. Do you have a customer supply agreement in place? Do you pass those costs through to your customers via the lease or the tenancy agreement? Either way, we have a set of authorization conditions that are coming in January, which have to make sure that we're going to have to align those agreements with the authorization conditions, but that's not having to be done with such urgency now. As I said a moment ago, it can happen as and when you're ready, example, when you've got new customers coming in, or when you naturally update your supply terms for other things. So that's the kind of the transition period. There's no need to panic about updating those supply agreements now, but you should treat your customers as if you do in accordance with those authorization conditions, even if your terms don't match those. If you've got a lease, it's unlikely to contain many of the things that authorization conditions are going to require. And so if it's not practicable to shoehorn those in, then the latest guidance says you don't have to go to great lengths to try and do that. In terms of charges, there's a lot of interface between the housing areas of law and the Landlord and Tenant Act in particular, and how service charges have to be reasonable in terms of the works and services that you provide, particularly under sections 19 and 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act, and that overlays a sense of reasonableness into those charges. And so when we're looking at fair pricing, a little bit more relaxed for those types of leases, particularly residential ones, where you have a dwelling and it falls within the reasonableness under the Landlord and Tenant Act. We also have to think about Section 11 maintenance costs and how you're recovering those. What I mean by that is if you've got a short hold agreement of less than 7 years with your tenants, then you can't recover the maintenance costs for the heat infrastructure, and it has to be done via rent. That will still stand. I'm not going to go into fair pricing and the priority services register and complaints handling processes, because we're going to be touching on those a little bit later and in later webinars. But the message is here that you're going to have to put a priority services register together and complaints handling processes together. So you're going to have to get your ducks in a row in order to comply with authorization conditions in relation to those. Next slide, please. So very quickly, just touching on governance and what this really means for your business, because you're going to want to protect your business as much as you're going to want to protect your customers. Therefore, you have to understand all the risks you're taking on if you're going to be an operator or a supplier. And also you're going to want an audit trail in the event that Ofgem do come and audit you later down the line. So you need to find somebody with significant managerial responsibility within the business. You have to keep a list of who those people are. They have to be fit and for their role. For example, they can't have any serious misconduct filed against them, no criminal convictions, no director disqualification. And so you have to have robust processes for making sure that those people with managerial responsibility are capable of doing their job. It's particularly important, as we've come across it. We might talk about in a moment with Jennifer about corporate liability, and that if you've got directors who are equally culpable because they've done naughty things with consent or through negligence, they can be culpable in the way that the corporation can be as well. So next slide, please. So very quickly, just to segue into Ian's piece, if you've got service contracts as a landlord-led scheme, you've got metering, billing and operation type outsourced services on a fee-for-service basis, so likely shorter-term arrangements, you're going to want to make sure that they fit with the authorization conditions. So you're going to look to the scope of services of those agreements to make sure that they align. You can't pass that regulatory burden down, but you need to make sure that the scope is wide enough to cover your responsibility under the regulation. Again, there'll be change in law procedures in the event, or there might be, in the event that you do need to change those scope of services, there might be a cost impact in relation to that. And you just have to keep an eye on data collection and reporting into Ofgem as well. So making sure that in those scope of services, it's not just the services, but making sure you collect the data. So I'm going to pass on to Ian now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. I think yeah, that's my slide. Yeah, so just to go through some of those points about regulation, perhaps we can show you a little bit, talk a bit about what we do. Switch to are a residential heat network service operator. We work for housing associations, local authorities and private building owners to look after their heat networks. And we started in metering and billing about 45 years ago and doing maintenance in dwellings connected to heat networks. And then we moved into plant rooms. And now we look after the whole supply chain for a heat network, from everything from we can help you buy gas right the way through to metering and billing and customer taking customer calls for metering and billing queries and maintenance. We also have approaching 30 ESCOs where we've taken the long-term, where building owners have transferred certain areas of risk such as debt and plant performance over to us for a long-term contract, 25 to 30-year contract. So we have a number of ways that we can support you. So we'll just have a quick talk about the billing requirements: accuracy, transparency, fairness, and accountability. These are the these are the things that we are very careful to put into our services. And as Rhianna said, your contractors and your service operators will need to be compliant with all the regulations, and that's exactly what we are doing, making sure our services are compliant. Regulatory requirements, and here's a sort of on the left-hand side are a list of the statements that Ofgem have made around regulation, and on the right-hand side a little bit about how we actually deliver those. So dwellings must be individually and accurately metered. So we have a number of metering systems, including a prepayment, a smart metering system, and credit systems. Our latest product, the G10, is fully compliant, or is fully compliant with regulations. It's designed to give customers a similar experience to SMETS, to gas and electricity smart meters. So we would like to think that residents who move out from electricity or gas dwelling into a heat network dwelling will have an experience that they recognise with their smart metering. You know, and our systems will collect reliable data, and that data will be collected in a way that is suitable for regulatory reporting. And indeed, we're working with Ofgem on some of their projects. We've done some to help them with some testing on the registration portal, for example, and we will be hopefully helping with the collection of data and proving that can be done successfully. So we have portals that collect the data, that make the data presentable to our clients, and sort of include things like fault alerts and compliance when the data is not compliant. So how many reads haven't we received, and what are we doing about it? Operators must give measurement, accuracy, and performance integrity again. Yeah, so that's making sure that we are monitoring and have KPIs for performance of our systems. So customers must receive clear, understandable, and itemized bills. Again, both our prepayment and our billing systems do that. Our prepayment systems, the G10 prepayment system has all the information available to the customer, showing the tariffs, the payments that they made, lists of the payments they made that are accessible on the screen. It also has an in-home display functionality to show them their usage in a number of user-friendly ways, and indeed includes a budgeting feature. Operators must ensure customers can easily access usage, tariff, and payment information. Again, as I said, that's provided by our prepayment systems, and again our customer portals as well for credit billing customers. Information about costs, service performance, and account status must be transparent and available. Again, showing those costs and the charges clearly on the bills and on the prepayment devices, on the in-home displays, on the prepayment devices. So we are ensuring that we're compliant with those. Fairness. Regulatory requirements, consumers must be charged fairly and proportionally for their actual usage. Our systems and the advice that we give on tariffs and the way that the costs that you put into the tariffs are designed to be transparent and to give you a solution to being compliant with those regulations. It should be also noted that the metering is mandatory. So and if you're flat rate charging customers, then they're likely to be using significantly more energy or heat than they would be if they were paying based on their consumption. And we see customers in social housing reduce their consumption by up to 50%. It's between 35 and 50%, 35% in a assisted living scenario and 50% in a general tenancy scenario. And that's so there is a real financial and fuel poverty element to making sure that customers are paying by their consumption rather than on a flat rate charge. Clear and justifiable tariff structures. Again, we can help ensuring that those tariffs are put together correctly with an appropriate costs being appropriately apportioned into those tariffs. And billing and debt recovery practices must support vulnerable customers and align with Ofgem fairness principles. Again, our processes around disconnection, around installing prepayment meters and switching people onto prepayment are compliant with regulations, and will, if those regulations change, we will ensure that they will remain compliant. And one of the problems I think that Ofgem have is balancing the debt with vulnerability, and especially on heat networks, where if people don't pay on heat networks, it has a dramatic effect on the financial status of the heat network. Whereas in the gas and electricity world, of course, debt is spread among millions of users. On a typical residential heat network, you might only have 100 or 300 users to spread that debt across. So that is a particularly important part of or difference between heat networks and the gas and electricity world. And of course, technical regulations, and we're going to go into all this into detail in the third present webinar. But to give you a flavour of why technical regulations are so important, and why, or at least technical looking after your heat networks well is so important. We see many heat networks which aren't managed correctly and aren't maintained properly, with a 35% efficiency, or as low as 35. I think we've seen them lower than that. And to give you an idea, 35% efficiency, your annual cost for gas going to that building would be £150,000, which is about £500 per property. And this is based on these prices below. If you can do targeted maintenance to improve the efficiency, things like common things we see: pumps running out of control. We see no night setback on the BEM systems. We see passing valves, incorrectly set controls. You can quickly bring that scheme efficiency up to 45%, and that brings down the cost per year per property from £500 to £400 or £400. So it makes a huge difference to the affordability of the heat network, just moving the efficiency up. And of course, as you go up the efficiency ladder, the returns are still there. Oh, sorry, I'm gone one too far. The returns are still there, but of course they become less. So it's really, there's an awful lot you can do with basic maintenance to make these heat networks more affordable and give a fairer deal to your customers. So what we offer services to help you with your improvement strategies, developing roadmaps for performance and compliance. We can look at prioritizing quick wins, just for example, the maintenance quick wins, and we can also look at longer term upgrades with paybacks, with real paybacks. So I feel at the moment perhaps too many paybacks are done based on poorly maintained heat networks, and you need to maintain them first and then start looking at your paybacks for capital works. We can look at continuous improvement cycles for you with measurable outcomes. And again, most of our contracts for performance have for maintenance have performance KPIs, and that's certainly something you should be looking at with your subcontractors, making sure that they are not just incentivized on ticking the boxes, but incentivized on delivering real performance improvements on your network. And of course, linking your an added benefit of improving your heat networks is being able to link those to your ESG commitments and your scope 1 and 2 emissions. You can make, some of you may have significant scope 1 and 2 emissions for your heat networks, and of course improving the way you operate them will bring that down, bring those down considerably. So that would be an added bonus. Right, so I think now I'm going to hand over to Jennifer again, who's going to talk about guidelines for and penalty policy. There, yeah.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, this is the serious end of the Ofgem roadmap. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So we've recently consulted on our enforcement guidelines for heat networks and the penalty policy. To be clear, the enforcement stages come at the end of a road, but this is just about giving you an idea of, you know, what the regulatory journey does look like. So started off at registration, that's going to be the first interaction, and via monitoring, that will be regular interaction between yourselves as operators and suppliers and us as the regulator. If things go badly, then we do come to the enforcement guidelines, and it is an important facet of regulatory underpinning that, you know, we've got that at the end of the road. So the guidelines set out how we will use our enforcement powers. We've got specific heat network enforcement guidelines, differentiating between gas and electricity and, for example, networks and distribution, which have the same guidelines. And the reason for that is because we do acknowledge that there's quite different registered parties in the sector. The penalty policy goes into a bit more detail about explaining how we would determine what a penalty would be in the very worst situation, and these documents implement the powers that have been set out in the market framework regulations. If you can move to the next slide, please. Sorry, I've already covered what's here. Just making sure that that is understood, that we have acknowledged that the differences in the heat network market. So as I've already explained, registration is going to be the first interaction, and regular data monitoring will be how we continue to contact and interact with operators and suppliers. There's various other ways that we get to hear about non-compliance, that will be primarily through our partners at Citizens Advice, the Energy Ombudsman, those other consumer advocacy bodies like Consumer Scotland, and Advice Direct Scotland, also the Extra Help Unit. So that there are a lot of advocacy bodies who provide us with intelligence through their statutory provisions. There's also social media, the national press, as we know, that a lot of focus can be put upon non-compliance, and when we hear of potential non-compliance, and especially when it affects a vulnerable consumer, then we are more likely to act. We will always engage directly or signpost to support for consumers who need that. We don't act for individual consumers. That's what the advocacy bodies are for, but we do very much look at the intelligence that they're providing, and if that identifies non-compliance, then we may request more information from the operator or supplier, and we will always allow that time to respond. Our absolute aim is to spot issues early, and if there is a non-compliance, then work with the operator or supplier to remedy that. Remedy does sometimes involve consumer compensation, especially if they have incurred costs via the non-compliance. The ultimate aim is to ensure fair outcomes for consumers, and obviously Ian's touched on some of the services that you can look to engage with other parties on. However, what you can't do is delegate your liability. If informal resolution is not successful, where cooperation breaks down, where a heat network operator or supplier does not engage with us, and where consumers are harmed, then we will look to escalate our interaction, because we do need to deter further breaches. We need to demonstrate that the regulations are being enforced against. So formal escalation can look like a formal compliance case, for instance. We can publish the outcomes of those. We can do those on an anonymised basis, where we spot a systemic issue that we recognise is happening across the sector, or we can actually call out specific examples and name the operator supplier where we're particularly concerned. Enforcement is the backstop in serious and egregious cases. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So the approach under heat networks, we're trying to be clear, proportionate, responsive, reflecting the different segments there. And it's only used where compliance activity has not been sufficient. The process does involve formal tools, and I'll touch on them quickly in the upcoming slides. And this outlines how enforcement works in practice. Next slide, please. So this is where the regulatory powers are more likely to come from. So we've got the authorisation conditions and other requirements. We've got the Competition Act and also General Consumer Protection Law. If you can move on to the next slide, I know that we're short on time. So what we investigate in the case opening criteria, if we don't have the power, we will not take on the action. So if we don't have the rule, and if we don't have the statutory obligation or duty, it's unlikely that we will take action. However, there may be more appropriate regulators who can take action under their own powers. So just to recognise that there are still, for instance, heat network metering and billing regulations. There are consumer protections which trading standards may become involved in, and there's obviously overarching the Consumers and Markets Authority when it comes to competition law concerns. We will consider whether it's a priority matter for us, and the apparent seriousness of the potential breach. It's important to acknowledge that we not only seek to fix the individual consumer issue, but that we seek to deter any further and future non-compliance. We will consider whether it's a priority matter, and this next section is very, very important. it's unlikely that we are going to be moving to an enforcement situation if the operator or supplier is willing and able to comply with its obligations and, you know, interacts with us in that premise. We will consider previous cases. So if there's a pattern of non-compliance, which we've dealt with over a period of time, then that's going to be a consideration as well. We will consider whether there's intention to cause consumer detriment, or if there's negligence or recklessness in the approach of an operator or supplier. And we will also consider if we have received the information directly from the regulated entity. So that would be from the registration and monitoring. Be honest, be transparent with us is the message here, really. If you're tell us something and it turns out that that's inaccurate, but it wasn't meant to be, tell us about it, reach out, engage with us. It's very unlikely that we would be you know, taking enforcement action on a mistake, you know, so please reach out, engage with us is my message here. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So this is slightly misleading, just to let you know, the running man up this hill, in my experience, it is not a fast situation. If there is an enforcement investigation, it does take a long time to go through, and it's definitely not something that we would undertake lightly, and it's not something that I would advocate for yourselves to undertake lightly. If you know, we do disagree with a compliance outcome, we would really try to resolve it at that early stage in order to avoid this kind of situation, because, you know, as you can see, it is very formal and it can be very time consuming. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So this is some of the tools that we have in enforcement. So we have the power to issue orders, which requires it says licensee here, but an authorised person to take action to address non-compliant behaviour. We've got the final orders and provisional orders, and the purpose of both is to achieve compliance. Where a provisional order is made to respond to the risk of immediate harm, these are quite time limited orders, and a final order is for you know, probably at the end, in order to make sure that our requirements have been implemented. They're not likely to be used in urgent situations, just to make that clear. Next slide, please. So in terms of penalties at the moment, they do mirror gas and electricity. However, we do assess proportionality. We do assess the individual party who has who will be subject to it. Obviously, we've not been through any of these cases yet, so we don't have any precedents to point to. We can't actually tell you exactly what will happen in any given circumstance. This is the maximum penalties that could be applied, and that's likely to be in the most egregious behaviour, and as I've shown before, at the end of a very long process. But we do have that legal framework. Ofgem is quite a mature regulator. We've got our 25th anniversary this year. You know, we have used these powers in extreme cases for gas, electricity, network distributors in the past. So it is something that we are capable of doing in the situation that requires it. You can move on to the next slide, please. Again, I will not go through this in great detail, but this shows the kind of steps involved in an investigation, and this is a formal enforcement investigation. It shows that there's lots of steps to go through, and it's time consuming both for ourselves and for any regulated party. Not only time consuming, but expensive. So the message here again is engage with us early and proactively, and avoid this kind of situation. But you know, we do have that mature process that's set up and ready to go if required. Next slide, please. And again. So in summary, we believe that regulations will create the stable, trustworthy environment that encourages investment in heat networks, and that is the aim. It's to provide that parity of consumer protection over time that is in place currently for gas and electricity customers. We appreciate that there's a lot of challenges in the sector, and you know, the Heat Networks Technical Assurance Scheme and guaranteed standards of performance, the pricing requirements will all be phased in after the initial phases. So we do acknowledge that there's still going to be a long road to getting that parity of consumer protection, but we have to start somewhere, and this is where we are now. We will continue to work with heat networks. There will still be consultations, and I appreciate there have been a lot of consultations, but we do appreciate the time that operators and suppliers and all interested parties take in engaging with us via our consultations. That just seeks to ensure that the rules, when they come in, they actually, you know, meet expectations and do what heat networks are need, as well as the consumers. And next, as I said, keep in touch with the new publications. As a first step, if you haven't already done so, please register with the Energy Ombudsman. There's also other voluntary schemes such as the Heat Trust, which can help get regulation ready as well. And please email us directly if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Just to wrap up then quickly before we move to questions, as a summary, what do you need to be doing right now? So don't panic. All existing schemes will be deemed authorised, so you don't need to authorise or register yourself with Ofgem at the moment, but the customer advocacy and redress scheme has already gone live in April. So you will have to register with the Energy Ombudsman for that, because your customers will be able to complain to the Energy Ombudsman currently at the moment. So be able to signpost them to Citizens Advice as well. At the moment, they're providing advice services too. Work out where you fit into this and where you fit into the puzzle and what your regulatory responsibilities are as a landlord. Do you take that on, or have you passed it down to an ESCO? Do the due diligence on the contracts you've entered into, and future-proof the ones that you're going to be entering into in due course as well. Your key dates to think about are the 27th of January next year, where most of the authorization conditions, that's the set of rules that you're going to have to live by if you are an operator or a supplier, those are going to be coming into force. You don't necessarily have to change your contracts around that, but you're going to have to comply with them. And then keep an eye as well for spring 2026, whether the digital service is going to go live for registration. You'll have until early 2027 to get yourself registered though. So that kind of concludes the presentation portion. We don't have a huge amount of time left for the questions. We could dive into them now. Ian, I don't know if you've got any preferences to the questions you want to tackle first. Otherwise, I can jump in.
Yeah.
So one of the first questions was around ESCOs in Section 11 maintenance costs, and this is under the Landlord and Tenant Act. If you've got a short hold tenancy, that's anything less than 7 years, you can't charge service charge for maintenance cost. It has to be wrapped in the rent. The same thing applies if you've got an ESCO. They can't charge the portion of their standing charges down to maintenance costs for those are short tenants. So in the same way as you do now, you'd have to split them out. The landlord would have to pay them directly.
I can answer one from Timor. Will central air conditioning to residence units billed via third parties, but cooling and heating generated on-site via centralized chiller units fall under this regulatory framework? The answer is yes and no. Yes, if it's a heat network. So if you are using chillers that distribute the cool or take the heat out using water through pipes, like a heat network, if it's a heat network, that does fall under the regulations. So cooling does fall under the regulations if it is a heat network. But if it's a VRF system, such as a variable refrigerant flow system, which uses gas, so that's more like an air conditioning system, then it doesn't fall. That doesn't fall under these regulations, and so that's possibly a bit confusing. But it has to be a heat network, so it has to transfer the heat by water, and if it does, and it's used for cooling, then it falls under the regulation as well as heating. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. There's a question here from Tom Vosper. Can you confirm if registration with the Energy Ombudsman is a legal duty with a deadline or just strongly recommended?
I can come in on that. So strongly recommended at the moment. It will become a legal duty, but actually, Rihanna, you might be able to correct me on this. I'm thinking the service of provision regulations. If you are a service provider, then you do need an ADR, alternative dispute resolution service. The Ombudsman is the energy ADR. However, I think that it becomes a legal duty from the start of regulations, the start of Ofgem regulations. I would need to be, I'll probably come back and confirm that with you.
Yeah, there's a separation. Sorry, go on.
So, yeah, no, carry on. Sorry, I was diving into the next one. Yeah, carry on.
No, I was going to say there's a separation between what you need to register with the Ombudsman and then registration later for authorisation under the scheme. It's two slightly separate things. Authorisation under the scheme, you've got until January 2027 to be doing that. But with the Ombudsman, to clarify that process, I think it should be registration now as soon as you can, but I can take that away and confirm for sure.
Right. There is a question about schemes which are unmetered and whether or not how they will be gain authorization. Well, if you've already got schemes, you're automatically going to be authorized. So this probably wouldn't apply to new schemes because all new schemes would have meters. And the question also talks about flats, apartments which need more than one heat meter and potentially the complexity and costs. That is an area where I think there's going to have to be further work on is the financial viability of heat metering. Certainly at the moment under the heat network metering billing regulations, there is a viability test, but I'm not sure yet what's going to happen to that viability test. Although I think Ofgem have said they're keen on promoting metering, heat metering more than it is. But certainly, if you would like to have a chat with us, please reach out to us, and we can talk about your schemes and how much it would cost to put meters in, but also the benefits of putting those meters in, and give you some case studies showing how much you're likely to save, and then you can look at the real financial viability of installing meters. Please do reach out to us.
Thank you. So we have another question. As Switch 2 are responsible for the billing in my building in Liverpool, how does this affect us as the landlord? Are we just the property owner, and therefore we do not have to register?
It's likely that Switch 2 will be acting as your agent, depending on the contracts you've got in place. So it really does depend on whether the regulatory burden has been transferred to them. If they're taking the risk and transfer and have adopted that system, then you may concession agreement which is strong enough to do that, that might be the case. But if it's an outsourced service on fee and they're not taking any risk in the operation of the system, then they won't be the operator. The supplier will be whoever has entered into the customer supply agreement or the lease or wherever those supply terms come from. So you wouldn't necessarily have passed it on if they're acting as your agent.
Yeah, absolutely. So we still probably need to discuss and look at some of the details around that. But yeah, in any case, we would help you with registration, whatever it is. Either we would register under our own, or we would help you with that registration. That's certainly something we will be doing.
I'll just combine these two questions. So what role does efficiency or heat loss play in tariff creation, and what do we anticipate a fair system efficiency would be?
Okay. Yeah. So the efficiency of the system, in other words, how much gas, how much energy from the gas gets delivered to the property, has a significant implication for your tariff, because if you buy gas at 5p a kilowatt hour, then and you're only 50%, you're 50% efficient, then you need to charge 10p a kilowatt hour at the residential heat meter. But that's not the whole story, because depending on the type of building you have, depends on how much of that heat is actually useful and is keeping the building warm, so how much background heat there is. So there's those sort of considerations to take into account. What is a good efficiency? That depends on your scheme, and it depends what your scheme is capable of. I don't think that you can actually say that 70% is good, or 60% is good, or 50% is good. 50% might be good in some scenarios, depending on your scheme, and it might deliver very acceptable outcomes for your customers in price and reliability. But of course, 60% scheme would be better, but that might not be possible with the installation you have. So I think it really is about how much is it costing your residents to heat their buildings on an annual basis. That's the sort of benchmark you should be really looking at. How much is it costing? How much are you charging your residents? What's the average annual charge? That's the sort of benchmark that should really, that's really the relevant one, the actual unit cost or the efficiency. As long as it's delivering a reasonable outcome for your customers, then I think we shouldn't get too hung up on the exact efficiency of the schemes.
I think there's also a risk in terms of how it relates with the tariffs. If you assume a fixed efficiency within your tariffs, and that applies for the length of however long it might be, the next 20 years, then if that efficiency drops, then if you're on the other side of that tariff, then you will be taking the risk in having to buy more gas or more electricity to put into that system. So your costs will go up, but you can't flow that through to the customers. If you have a variable efficiency, so the efficiency tracks how efficient it is in real time, it might reduce over the years, then you'll be able to flow those costs through to customers, but on the understanding that will make it more expensive, and that you should be, and Hentas will, I'm sure, come along and help align us with this, but making sure that efficiency is as good as it can be, so that we keep those costs down.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to make it as good as possible. That's absolutely right. And that slide I showed on the our sort of efficiency ladder sort of demonstrates the savings you get at different efficiencies. So you can make your own judgment on what you think is the best solution for your customers, but certainly 35% isn't. It needs to be higher than that. Yeah.
So we've got quite a few questions still to answer. It may be that we can follow up after the webinar?
Yeah.
With a lot of these.
Yeah. Do you want to do one more, or? I'm just... Oh, right. Okay. So there's one about the penalties and fines for social housing sector, and the fact that they cannot be passed on to customers, but RSL's only income is rent. So what they're saying is, where do you, if you get fined, how do you stop that going into the being paid for by your customers? It's a good question.
So I would like to focus on the compliance aspect of things, to be honest with you. I hope from my messages today that I've explained that, you know, a fine comes at the very end of a long process, a long and costly process before you even get to the fine element. It's likely to incur legal costs, it's likely to incur lots of third party costs for yourselves. You know, come to us early, engage with us early, engage with us proactively, avoid fines. And I think that's the main focus, rather than you know, fines being passed through to consumers. Fines being passed through to consumers is going to be a long way off at the moment, as you've seen from how long an investigation would happen. So I'm certainly not focused on that messaging myself.
How far would guaranteed standards of service payments be away?
So we're planning on consulting on guaranteed standards next year, and we really do want to receive information via registration and monitoring in order to inform how we will implement them. And again, that's likely to be phased in.
Yeah, because that's the other. It's not just fines; it could be the guaranteed service standard service payments, which would end up going back to the depending on your contractual situation. Yeah. Shall we bring this to a close and answer the remaining questions offline? I think we've run over time now. What time is it? Yeah, we're 10 minutes over time. So that's thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with us. Yeah. And we will see you again. Please join us for our next webinar, which is on the I think, if I go back to the original slide, is on the 11th,
I think.
Yeah, the 11th. November. Yeah, I've got them here. Yeah, which is on the I'll just put it, which is on the 11th of November. And we're going to do a deeper dive into customer protection. And then on the 11th of December, we're going to talk about technical standards.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.